helping you crack the code to productivity. Every Wednesday's our community.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final session of the 13-week productivity clinic. So we are actually going to be summarizing all the conversations that we've had so far, and we're going to bring together all the learnings in this particular session. So if you've not joined the previous session, this might provide you with an overview, but what I would do is probably strongly urge you to go back and look at what we've covered so far. Now, the session is going to be in the format like this. We're going to be talking about the current realities. Why am I doing that? Primarily because I just want to show you what is happening in the current state of play, what is working and what is not working, but what we did, which is what the lessons learned would cover from our perspective, where we have helped various organizations go through change. And then what we're going to do is bring all that we discussed for the last 12 weeks together to make something that is cohesive so that you can take this and do something with this insight. Now, as I mentioned, let's talk about the current reality. Now, if you look at it, we are living in a time which is uncertain. There are so many polycrises. Look at the economic war, trade war, the actual war that is happening. It's impacting businesses from every direction. Now, to survive and thrive, we can't just rely on traditional siloed thinking, right? We know that. We are now living in a connected world. And we spoke about that quite a bit in our previous sessions. Now, we also talked about how we need to change the mindset because new challenges and polycrisis wants us to think differently. We need to actually blend mindsets. We need to bring analytical thinking into it. But more importantly, how do we bring the human component into the equation? In other words, we're going to be talking about people, connecting your people, data, and your profit strategy into one cohesive vision. The last 12 weeks, we spoke about purpose, we spoke about customer centricity, employee engagement, leadership challenges, cultural, building culture, emotional drivers, and so on and so forth. Now, today, we are going to bring all these together. Now, if you look at this, the new world or the new way of doing things does not rely only on processes. When we talk about organizations, traditionally, it's always been about profits. They try to use processes to get things better, and then people come last. And it's not surprising that we lose people, we actually get rid of people when our profit gets hurt, right? That's always been the thinking. Now, that's not actually going to help us go into the next phase where we have to grow. I mean, if you look at the data, 65 years is what the time that it would take for a company that is in S&P 500 to actually lose its shine. This was, I'm talking of pre-data era. That is, let's say, from prior to 2000, year 2000. And now it's what? 15 years. So if you use your traditional siloed thinking, you're not going to stick around for a long time. So now I want you to imagine if every decision you make is harnessed based on data and heartbeat of your people, which we always talk about, right? We've talked about humanics and mechanics, which is the process and the people element coming together. And that is where real power kicks in. And you start accelerating the organization's performance. Now, if you look at it, this is basically a study by McKinsey where they said, a lot of CEOs are now starting to prioritize culture. Earlier, culture was that fluffy thing. But what we have seen in the last 12 weeks is where we saw how profit and performance gets influenced by the behavior, which gets influenced by how people think, which is engagement, which gets influenced by how people feel, which is then influenced by their core values. It's like an inverted pyramid. And companies are now starting to prioritize this. Now, this is the reality that is we are currently facing. Now, I would like to just touch on why the old or traditional models are not actually working. So, if you really look at it, uh, our research, which we have done with our companies and clients, and the body of research that is out there, shows that when you take an approach which currently is based what I would call as the old way or the rigid model of change, it actually doesn't work. It confirms that 70% of your cultural transformation basically fail. That's a lot. That's a lot of money that is getting invested, and that is amazingly, surprisingly, shockingly relevant information that leaders fail to ignore. We talked about the friction points that exist in culture and why leaders should be more concerned about the friction points and measuring those rather than measuring vanity metrics. Now, if you look at that, just that big picture, 70% of your transformations fail. That's one big thing. Now, a lot of companies, if you remember, starting from 2000, wanted to upgrade on tech because of the tech boom. Everyone wanted to get into this digital transformation journey. But you know what? Research has clearly shown that more than 51% or 50, more than 50%, that's half, say that it's not actually seen any improvement in performance or profit. You know why? Because of the humanics problem that we spoke about. Humanics is the people. You might have the fantastic process in place, you might have brilliant strategy, but if your people are not willing to take that and embrace that, it's not going to have any impact, is it? So it's not surprising that 70% of your cultural changes fall flat on its face. Now, when we look at humanics or the people problem, engagement or disengagement or presenteeism, whatever you might call it, or well-being challenges, that's impacting productivity. And globally, that's costing us 9.8 trillion or 8.8 trillion. I think it's 8.8, if I'm not wrong. $8.8 trillion annually. Now, why does this happen? Because people look at process, profit process people rather than people process profit approach. Now, what we have seen is when companies aim for short-term gains, which unfortunately a lot of companies are looking for in a bigger context, right? It's short-term gains over long-term sustainability. When you focus on that, this is what happens. And cultural change falls flat on its face. And normally, when we talk about cultural change, it's like you don't actually enforce it because culture means changing. Changing means fear. And we know fear at a deeper level needs to actually be addressed by showing that employees can trust you and you are actually empathetic to them. Because without that, cultural change fails. And we talked about this model, I think, on the employee side of things and how do you manage a cultural change. I think it was week 4 or week 5, we spoke about this, right? So to address that, you need to understand what is actually driving people, right? You need to understand what's happening between those years. We did talk about various things like you could have the best, I did talk about what we call as the mental, technical, physical exercise. If you imagine the best team that you can think of, and you can actually quantify what makes them stand out. It's their mental capability or their physical capability or the technical capability. When you do this exercise, you will always realize that it's the magic happens between your ears. The mental faculty far outweighs your physical capability and your technical prowess, right? It's the mind over matter analogy kicks in very, very, very quickly, right? So if you look at it, we spoke about the signs of system 1 and system 2 thinking, which is conscious and subconscious, which basically is think fast, act slow, or yeah, think slow, act fast. Sorry, I always get that wrong. So that is Daniel Canahan's thinking. We need to start understanding the conscious, the subconscious, and the preconscious mind. And we need to understand how that drives our behaviors, our thinking, our feelings, and ultimately emotion. When we spoke of emotion, I said it is energy in motion that actually gets you to feel in a certain way, to act in a certain way, to think and act in a certain way. And we also need to understand what is happening from the point of view of neuroeconomics, where things are actually adding more color to what we thought was a black box, right? By understanding the brain and by understanding how to tap into the positive aspects of it, we can transform decision making processes into amazing systems that people will come on board straight away. Now, when you look at why things have failed, if you look at the economic side of things, it is, we all assume, I mean, the theory of economics assumes that people are rational actors. I have not come across one rational person, when it comes to the question of managing crisis. Of course, that's the wrong thing to say, sorry. I mean, I have had a few leaders who act rationally, but even they are guided by emotion more than their rational thought, but they have mastered the act of balancing them both. Generally, by understanding that people are not rational, they have their emotional desire to do things differently, by understanding how that impacts what they do, how they do it, can actually help improve performance and productivity, right? So, if you do that, and we have seen by understanding how people think and feel, where we used to actually measure, which is all about the blueprint that we are going to be talking about, which we spoke about earlier, measuring, having the right metrics, we've seen at least 10 to 20% jump in creativity alone. With some organizations, we have seen a net growth of more than 20 to 30 million pounds in the top line. And with some bigger organizations, we have even seen 30, 40 million pound profitability, the net profit. That is significant because they have all started understanding how do you make your employees feel, how do you build a process around it so that you can start getting them to perform better. So the message here is inspiring, right? If we start redesigning our systems, our processes, our businesses with the human behavior, the brain and mind, we can unlock performance gains that traditional models never even knew exist, right? But do these ideas work in practice? That's what we've been talking about the last 12 weeks, where we started looking at specific aspects of the business. We talked about the deal framework. I'll come back to it later. But that is where we started impacting. We've shown that by taking a mindful and meaningful approach to what you measure, how you measure it, and why you measure it, and by getting people involved, you can unlock stellar performance and productivity. Now, what have we learned the last 12 weeks? I keep referencing back to the last 12 weeks. So people who are here, some of them would have actually, you know, so I know a few who are regular visitors and some have dipped in. So I would like to actually summarize the big lessons that we've learned, right? The last 3 weeks. The first one is you need to understand data, you need to understand emotions. When you tap into the power of data and tap into the power of emotions, you unlock super performance, right? So it was a journey, what we undertook the last 12 weeks from theory to practice. And it actually revealed gold. It showed how and what companies did to tap into the challenges that they were facing by understanding what was driving those challenges from a human cognitive level, right? And what we have seen, I'm just going to put some basic stuff here because I can't cover all that, but what we will talk about is the first thing is about customer centricity. Because without customers, your business does not exist, right? So it is not a catchphrase. And what we said was when you are actually measuring customer centricity, try and measure the emotional frictional points where the journey gets impacted. And when we spoke about customers, we didn't speak about external customers. We also spoke about internal customers because we said if you say your organization is customer centric, it does not mean that it belongs only to the service people. It is something that is baked into the habit of every employee, every department, and not just customer service. In our clinic, we actually said that when customer focus becomes everyone's job, loyalty, we spoke about the three-dimensional model of loyalty, satisfaction, and commitment. It actually shows how you can improve your productivity, performance by focusing on satisfaction, loyalty, and commitment. So that was the first thing. The second bit, which we talked about, was the role of employees. Because you've got a great customer base, but if you have got employees who you don't have employees, or you have employees who can't deliver, that customers are not going to stick around for long, are they? So we talked about employees in a few of our clinics. We talked about how engagement can be impacted by how people feel and what we can do to address that. We also talked about purpose-driven employees, and I spoke about specifically as to how few hospitality chains use the power of purpose to connect people at a very, very emotional level. Because we've seen when people understand the why behind anything, the value they add, we've seen performance go through the roof. And we've demonstrated it through what we've seen. So connect people with a clear purpose. And how do you do that? Please, I would rest. I mean, this was the first clinic. So if you have not, if you are curious to know, just go and watch that video. And that basically has shown that you can just create an organization where people are excited to be part of, right? And the third thing which we talked about is leadership, because you cannot have an organization which is humming and buzzing without leaders playing a vital role. Leaders have to walk the talk. We talked about leaders, the role of leaders, and how they could become part of the ecosystem. Talked about culture as nothing but a combined behavior of leadership, right? If you look at it, that's what it is, isn't it? How a leader behaves or the leadership team behaves sets the tone for culture. That then percolates down. It gets amplified if you have some quirks or people want to create their own kingdoms, that behavior gets amplified. So we talked about leadership and we talked about the importance of setting the tone by actually doing what you want people to do, right? And we showed how you can actually create a cultural change by starting at the top and then rolling it gradually across the organization. So by the time it reaches the frontline employees, a lot of changes already happened within the organization. You don't have to roll culture. And we have seen this. We've seen this with some bigger organizations working across Europe or EMEA, or even organizations within UK, where we have seen the change happen quickly when you take time to roll from the top, one level at a time, roll down, then roll up or roll all over. Yes, it looks like it's going to take a lot of time, but trust me, the impact of that was brilliant. And we talked about this in our sessions earlier. So what we have learned, leadership sets the tone. And how and why and what of the employee's journey gets employees engaged. And by baking a process that is reliant on people believing that they're going to add value and becoming more focused on delivering and reducing the frictions between transactions creates a great customer-centric organization. Now, what is the payoff? I mean, there are so many lessons that we've learned. Like, let me talk about two or three cases where what we learned. One particular organization, so it's a hospitality, this is a single hotel. They were enthusiastic about the whole thing. Customer service, big tick. Leadership, big tick. But they were not treating their employees properly. And that was primarily because the leader was influenced by the leadership team. It was a weak leader that then diluted the whole process. And the impact of the cultural change was abysmal. So we had to do some course correction. We had to work with the leader, get him, get them to see what was going wrong, where it was happening, who was pushing their buttons, and we helped them overcome that. And when they saw that, it became apparent of the people who were toxic within the senior leadership team, and they actually ring fenced them to ensure that the change happens. So even you might have the greatest intentions, but if you are not strong enough to see through as a leader, then the cultural change can fail. If you don't address it, that's an issue. Going to the other end of the spectrum, we have seen some organizations where they have started with a clear why. This is started in the UK, but then they went to Europe, and then they did this step by step. First thing, they didn't rush into it. It was a 2-year journey. But the, the turnover that increased, the profitability that increased was significant, right? They start off with the why. They wanted to give their employees a clear purpose. Why are you coming here? Why do you walk through the door? Then what they did was, then they said, okay, now that we have got this, how are we going to ensure that they all align by what we want them to do? So the strategy was communicated, clarified, created in a way that people could understand and understand what is that they are doing to help achieve that bigger picture. Then they talked about measuring how people are feeling. And that was a significant move where they built an ecosystem or a safe environment for people to express their words and opinions and feelings. And it was actually dealt with. They then adopted the same approach to look at the customer journey, where they look at the customers, what their journey was, the emotional frictional points, and then use that to build something which is significant. So you can see that it has an impact. And what we are talking about here is not something which came out of thin air. We've seen it work in reality. Now, that framework basically starts off with this. We always talk about it in our workshops. We start off with this, but deliberately I pushed it back because I wanted to give you the context where we have come and how this all fits in. I'm going to run through this very quickly. Organizations that actually have strategy have to actually have great employees to implement it. But to implement that, we need to have customers, because if without customers, there is no business. Now, the first part of the framework, D, is delivery, is where customers and employees intersect. This depends on what the interactions that happens between these two people. Now, it could be product, service, sales, support, anything and everything. That delivery is impacted when the employees are not engaged. They don't understand why they are doing what they are doing, right? And that also has an impact on alignment. If the company does not understand what the customers want or understand or predict what the customer needs, then that has an impact on all of this. And last but not least, it's the leadership. The leaders drive the whole thing. It's like the propeller, right? So we have talked about this. Now, we every week we try to dissect one of this or a few of these, right? That basically then brings us to the performance blueprint. This is basically what we call as the living system for sustainable growth. We actually have, just like how a business has got, how we actually do MOTs for our cars, where we actually, when has got a checkpoint that it has got to be cleared, we have actually created some kind of a checkpoint for the business. And there are various components that go with it. Now, this model is not basically designed for a 5-year plan. Earlier 5 years used to be a long-term strategy, then it became 2, 3 years now, long-term strategy. So this framework allows you to start doing things dynamically. The essence of all the discussions that we had over the last 12 weeks are all part of this, right? It talks about linking quantitative data like analytics and your measurements and other things with qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative data, I mean the people data, like your engagement, your people's feelings, customers' feeling, customer experience, your cultural feelings, and so on and so forth in a feedback loop. Like it uses real-time people metrics to adjust your strategy. So if you're always on course, then know you don't need to know what things are not working. But if you steer off course, the checkpoints will automatically point out that these are the areas that you need to be focusing on, and this is where you are actually moving away. When you do this, and we've seen that, as I mentioned earlier, we've actually seen 80 to 100, 120% jump in the profits in 3 years. That's significant. For bigger organizations, that's a significant number. Now, if you have a framework, imagine that it allows you to see where you are by doing some simple checks, by asking some simple questions, so that you can course correct. And that's what this does. So we actually have the 4 bits. The first bit is where you diagnose the information. You talk about what is the thing that you need to be measuring. And we talked about the friction, right? We talked about measuring the customer friction. And don't rely on vanity metrics, because vanity metrics will not help you diagnose what the systemic issues are, what the people challenges are. So look for issues that would solve a business problem. Always start with the customers in mind, right? It's not about profits or if someone is buying, whether they buy it for a pound or a p or a million, start thinking about them from the point of view, what can you do to address the friction that exists in your sales process, in your service process, in your support process, that can enhance their experience. Look for metrics that would really matter. Go back and say, okay, for that to happen, your internal customers have, your external service providers have to rely on internal service providers, internal employees. So build the culture of how is that getting impacted? What can you measure which impacts that? For example, if I'm expecting something from someone internally, which allows me or affords me to serve my customer, if the person is not doing that, I can connect the impact of the customer attrition to the individual not delivering what they said, right? So start making and building meaningful metrics. We have talked about measuring meaningful, creating meaningful metrics for in a few episodes now. Now, once you do that, then start connecting, like how I said. Then you start creating actions, what we call as micro interventions. Go for grand gestures, it never works. Go for micro interventions, but then always keep an eye on what have we learned, what is working, what is not working, why did we fail. Go back to the customers and ask them, seek feedback, use that to learn. Now, if you look at it, you've again got a DEAL, which basically is another deal framework which allows you to deal with organization performance, right? So we talk about those 440 checkpoints. What are they? So we talk about, you know, it is, we use cultural index, which basically covers process, agility, and all that stuff. We talk about the emotional component, which is about, pride, your passion, your empowerment, your leadership, your communication, and so on and so forth. And how do you act? What are the things that you measure? It's the ownership. Is the conflict resolved or not? Is is it customer led? What is the impact it's having? And what are you doing to improve that? So we actually talk about this in detail, and you can see that it brings all these things together and create a 40-point checklist. You want to know more about a 40-point checklist? Please feel free to get in touch with me. In fact, we'll be posting something on LinkedIn about the 40-point checklist after this. Now, we've come to a stage where we have done all this. I've told you what we have done so far and how it all connects. The theory and practice have connected, and how companies have used people, process data and profit data to create ecosystems that really survive and thrive. Now we have started last 2 years, AI has come in. Now, what happens? This is basically not something that we need to be afraid of. It's an invitation for us to reinvent, right? So we are actually baking AI into our systems so that companies can start learning. Because if you look at it, all the decisions, all the traditional models that we have relied on so far have relied on what? Historical data, right? But if you want to drive forward, you can't look at the rearview mirror and go forward. You can't look at the past to go forward, right? The data that we have is always talking about, oh, that happened. My manager treated me like this. Oh, my customer felt like this. Rather than what is my customer feeling now? What does that mean in the future? That's where AI can help. AI can start looking at the trends that are emerging. Start looking at what you're doing. Imagine having a friend, invisible friend who's always with you, who can help you course correct, steer you in the right direction if you're straying away from the path, help you to predict and start taking action. That's where AI kicks in. And there are a lot of productivity tools that are there, a lot of tools that are there. It's about bringing all these together. Now, having said that, people and businesses are rushing into buying licenses for A, B, C, D, E software. That's another thing that I am seeing with one organization that I'm working. They've got around 36 different tools. My head started spinning. I said, what do you do? Oh, we use this for this. And suddenly I mean, it didn't make any sense because it's, yes, AI is a shiny new thing. But the question you need to ask is, how is it going to impact my business? How is my humanics? Because without involving your people, if you're going to buy licenses, are they comfortable? Is it actually going to help them improve performance? And will they actually use those tools? Because you remember, AI means it's a fear of, it brings in a fear, right? Cultural change brings fear. When you talk of AI, it's the fear of unknown. So if I ask employees to, I pay this organization, I paid a lot of money for tools, but the employees are not using. That's frustrating for them, primarily because the employee thinks if I use it and if I show that it works, what happens to my job? There's that fear. When we talk about your core values, that fear drives everything. Didn't we? Didn't we speak about that? Yes, we did. So what do you need to do? You need to build the trust. You need to show that no, this is basically a tool that is provided to you to help you perform better. And we have started working with organizations where we have helped save at least 8 to 10 hours of a week just by choosing the right tool, one, two tools to help them improve. We built an AI ecosystem for them so that they can start looking at the employee data, the customer data, so it starts making more sense. So AI is not a foe. There's nothing to be afraid of, but we are bringing it back, and you need to embrace it as a business to bring that back and link it back to your human data, to your customer data, to your process data, and to your profit data, and see what is happening. You can use it to compare against what competitors are doing. Start predictive modeling. Start simulating scenarios which you couldn't do earlier. Hey ho, we are living in a golden age, and we need to tap into this, right? So, what can you do differently? If you are going to be looking at it, I mean, I initially, when I wrote it, this is something that I did yesterday. I did this presentation yesterday and I put 12 months. But when I reflect on it, the pace at which things are changing at the moment, because of AI, because of other things, and the geopolitical instability, all the polycrises that we talked about, 12 months is a long time for a business to change or not change. So instead of calling it Q1, I would say month one, month two, month three, month four. So you could actually start focusing on what are the key things that are creating friction in my business? What can I do to address that? Start diagnosing. What can you understand from the data that is currently being thrown? How do I use it to get the best for my customers, for my employees, to improve my strategy, to align what we want? Then I would start looking at, okay, now that we've got the data, we've got this, how do I look at this from a leadership point of view? How do I ensure that it is baked into the culture? How do I start rolling it from the top very, very quickly so that by the time it reaches the frontline employees, people have understood that this is a genuine intent, that the leaders are actually putting people before process, before profit. Now, once you have this data, start collecting data, go back and start building. You can do Q3 or month 3 insight as part of your diagnosis. Also, start building some analytics. Look at what was happening in the past. Use data modeling, use AI tools to then see what could be differently handled or done differently in the future. Happy to reach out to me if you're stuck or if you want to know how you can apply this to your current scenario. Always happy to help. Then once you have this, go back and see, okay, what is the information that we need to collect and use so that we can start building it again and again and again, so that it becomes a very positive, self-sustaining, successful mechanism. You do that, then you will see that your performance and productivity goes through the roof. You've seen boosts of, as I told you, 8 to 10 hours saving in a 40-hour week is 20 to 25% improvement in productivity, isn't it? And imagine that is actually helping you get your employees to do something much more creative, much more better. And you're creating an organization which actually cares. And that's what we are all about. We want to help leaders build organizations, companies build organizations, scale quickly, effectively, but by harnessing the power of people, using the latest thinking. The cultural index, or what we call as the checkpoint, it's a 40 checkpoints, looks at employees' feelings, employees' engagement levels, elements that impact culture, right from leadership, pride, passion, your values, to how clear your employees are about the role, the vision, the cap for the company. All these things come together, and what your customers think of you, bring all that together to create one cohesive ecosystem. Bolt on AI so that you can start always building it as a dynamic ecosystem and start implementing things. Remember, even a 1,000-mile journey starts with a single step. So I hope the weeks that we have spent together has helped you realize that people matter. And if you care about people, and if you put people first, processes will be used effectively, profits will follow. Thanks for listening.